By the time HR puts you on a PIP, they are usually not trying to understand what went wrong. They are trying to control what happens next. That is the first thing people miss. They think the meeting is the beginning of a process, when in many companies, it is the final packaging of a decision that has already been emotionally, politically, and legally prepared. You walk in thinking this is about performance. HR walks in thinking about documentation, consistency, manager exposure, and whether your reaction will create risk. That is why the tone feels so strange. It sounds calm, neutral, even supportive, while your body is telling you something much darker is happening. Because something darker is happening. The company is often shifting from managing your work to managing your exit, and it does that long before anyone says the words performance improvement plan. Here's what actually happens. Before the PIP appears, your manager has usually been building a private narrative about you, and HR has already been asked how hard it would be to remove you. Not always directly. Sometimes it starts with softer language like, I'm having concerns about fit, or I'm not sure this role is the right match anymore. That language matters. In American offices, people rarely say, I want this person out, before they know it is safe to say. So they say things that sound developmental. They say communication gaps, stakeholder friction, inconsistent judgment, visibility concerns, leadership presence, missed alignment, resistance to feedback. If you've ever heard those phrases and felt like they were weirdly hard to argue with, that is because they are built to be hard to argue with. They sound objective while staying flexible enough to mean whatever the system needs them to mean later. This is the part nobody warns you about. HR usually does not need to know whether you are truly underperforming in some universal sense. They need to know whether the manager has a coherent story, whether that story can survive scrutiny, and whether the company can show it handled the situation in a standardized way. Truth helps, but defensibility is what travels. That is why high performers still end up on PIPs. If your output is strong but you create discomfort, threaten control, challenge sloppy leadership, or make someone politically insecure, performance alone will not save you. A lot of people learn this too late. They assume good work creates safety, when in some environments, uncontrollable competence creates danger. Imagine the employee who fixes broken processes, catches errors before leadership does, and gets pulled into messy projects because they are reliable. Their manager praises them in private, says things like, I don't know what I'd do without you. And then succession planning happens. The same employee is quietly left out because strong is not the same as promotable when your manager does not trust your loyalty, your deference, or your willingness to play along. That contradiction confuses people for months. They think if I was so valuable, why am I suddenly a problem? Because value and safety are not the same category. You can be useful to the business and threatening to the people who control your path inside it. Once that private concern hardens, HR starts learning things before you do. They learn your manager no longer sees you as worth rehabilitating. They learn that informal coaching is being retroactively reinterpreted as evidence. They learn which examples will be used later, which Slack messages might be screenshotted, which meeting moments suddenly matter. And that changes everything, because once HR is brought in, everyday ambiguity starts getting converted into a record. A vague concern becomes a pattern. A tense meeting becomes an interpersonal issue. A deadline that used to be described as aggressive suddenly becomes a miscommitment. You think people are still discussing your future. Often they are discussing the file. Here's the quiet part. HR is usually involved before the PIP not because they want to help you improve, but because they want the manager to stop improvising. Managers are messy. They vent, contradict themselves, overpromise, show favoritism, lose patience, and say reckless things in one-on-ones they would never want repeated in court, to leadership, or in an employee relations review. HR's role is often to convert that mess into a controlled sequence. They slow the manager down, tighten the language, remove emotion, and create the appearance of fairness. That is why the final PIP document often feels oddly polished compared to everything that came before it. The company may have been disorganized for months, but suddenly the wording is crisp. The expectations are formal, and every sentence sounds intentionally sterile. That polish is not for your clarity, it is for institutional protection. What makes this worse is that your behavior starts being interpreted through a new lens before you know the lens exists. Once the internal question becomes, Can we justify formal action? Almost nothing you do will be read neutrally. If you defend yourself, you may be framed as resistant to feedback. If you go quiet, you may be framed as disengaged. If you ask for specificity, you may be framed as combative. If you work harder, they may say the urgency proves you always could have performed better. This is why people on the edge of a PIP often describe a surreal period where everything suddenly feels off. Meetings get colder, feedback gets vaguer, and normal mistakes start landing with abnormal weight. The system is not just observing you anymore. It is testing whether the story holds. Look at how this shows up in real office life. A manager who used to answer your Slack messages quickly now goes silent, then replies hours later with strangely formal wording. In meetings, they stop building on your ideas and start asking you to restate basic things you obviously know. Not because they need the answer, but because public uncertainty is useful when someone is trying to lower your standing. Then comes the performance review language. You may still get a rating that does not look catastrophic, which makes the PIP feel even more shocking later. But read the phrasing carefully. Needs stronger cross-functional influence, would benefit from more strategic communication, can be highly effective when aligned with stakeholder expectations. That kind of wording is often doing double duty. On the surface, it sounds like a development note. Underneath, it is planting the category they may use against you later. Here's what HR already knows at that stage. They know whether your manager has lost confidence in you as a long-term employee. They know whether another reorg, headcount review, or leadership reshuffle is creating pressure to clean up perceived problems. They know whether you are being discussed as someone to fix, someone to contain, or someone to move out. And those are very different conversations. The tragedy is that from your side, they can look almost identical. A reorg is a perfect example. You are told the structure is changing to improve agility, clarify ownership, or better align with strategic priorities. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is also a way to remove protection, isolate certain employees, and clear political space without making the conflict look personal. The employee who once had visibility to a senior leader gets moved under a less supportive manager. Their scope changes, their context disappears, and then 6 weeks later, they are told they are struggling in the new structure. Struggling compared to what? Compared to a role that was redesigned without the control, under leadership that no longer wants them there. This is the deeper problem. Formal processes in corporate America often arrive after the social verdict, not before it. The interview for your promotion may happen after the real choice has already been made. The feedback conversation may happen after confidence is already gone. The PIP may happen after HR has already shifted from coaching logic to case logic. That is why people feel insane in these situations. They're responding to the visible process as if it is still alive, while the invisible process is already over. Once you see that, a lot of strange behavior makes sense. The manager who says, "I want you to succeed," while excluding you from key meetings is not conflicted in the way you think. They may want you to succeed emotionally as a person while still wanting you going organizationally. People can feel fond of you and still participate in your removal if the system rewards distance more than fairness. The same goes for coworkers. One of the most dangerous people in a PIP environment is not the loud enemy. It is the supportive colleague who keeps sounding concerned while subtly shaping perception upward. They tell you, "I'm sure this will blow over." Then mention to leadership that you seem unusually stressed. They offer to help with a deliverable, then make sure people know they had to step in. That is how reputations shift in modern offices. Not through dramatic attacks, but through tiny perception edits made by people who stay socially clean while moving you into a weaker category. HR usually understands that dynamic more than employees think, but understanding it is not the same as interrupting it. Because HR's first loyalty is rarely to the cleanest truth. It is to process stability, leadership coordination, and minimizing institutional risk. If your manager is politically valued, articulate, and already aligned with their leadership chain, HR will often work from that center of gravity. They may ask for more examples, recommend clearer feedback, and encourage consistency. But that does not mean they are independently reopening the case. It usually means they are helping the case survive. This is why the PIP meeting often feels so emotionally dead. The human tension is obvious, but the language is drained of humanity. You're talking about your career, your income, your identity, your mortgage, your family, your health insurance. They are talking about milestones, expectations, check-ins, stakeholder trust, measurable improvement, and next steps. That gap is not accidental. Neutral language creates distance, and distance lets institutions do hard things without feeling like they are doing violence. Here's the part people resist because it hurts. When HR gets involved early, they are often learning not just what you did, but how removable you are. Are you likely to push back? Do you know policy? Have you documented inconsistencies? Are there comparators? Have others been treated differently? Are you connected to powerful leaders? Could this become a discrimination, retaliation, or whistleblower issue? If the answer to those questions is no, the path gets smoother, not morally smoother, operationally smoother. And if the answer is yes, the tone may become even more polished. More meetings, more care in wording, more theatrical concern. That extra professionalism can fool people. They think the company is becoming more thoughtful when sometimes it is just becoming more careful. A PIP is not always predetermined. Sometimes it is real, recoverable, and tied to actual performance repair. But the reason this topic hits so hard is because so many professionals can feel the difference. They can tell when a plan is meant to guide them and when it is meant to formalize the ending in a language the company can live with. You feel it in the examples they choose. You feel it in what is missing from the narrative. You feel it when months of context disappear, and only the moments that support one conclusion remain. And once you understand that, the deepest betrayal becomes visible. The PIP is not just a performance document. It is often the first time the company shows you, in official form, that it has been having a private conversation about your future without you for much longer than you knew. That is why people never forget these experiences. It is not just the threat of losing the job. It is the realization that while you are still trying to solve the problem inside the relationship, the institution had already moved the problem into procedure, and procedure does not care how sincere you are. By the time HR puts you on a PIP, the most important meeting has usually already happened. It just happened without you in the room. That is the hidden rule most employees learn only once. In corporate life, the formal conversation usually starts after the real decision stops being up for debate. So when the PIP finally lands, do not mistake structure for openness or documentation for uncertainty. The paperwork may look like a plan, but the timing tells you what it really is. By then, HR often knows exactly what your manager wants, exactly how the story will be told, and exactly what version of fairness the company needs on file. The only thing still being tested is whether the ending will be quiet. Because by the time they ask whether you can improve, they are often no longer deciding whether you belong. They are deciding whether your exit can be made to look reasonable. And that is the coldest part of all. A PIP does not begin when they hand you the document. It begins the day the company starts preparing language for a future it no longer wants you in.